Hello, friends. Good afternoon. Welcome to the May meeting of the Economic Club of Traverse City. My name is Jeff Guy, and I'm a member of the Economic Club Board. Our club president, Kathleen Guy, had a business commitment today and has asked me to manage this meeting in her absence. We are very excited to bring you an excellent speaker today in Traverse City City Clerk Ben Marentette. Before we get to Ben, though, I have a couple of announcements to make regarding the club's upcoming meeting schedule. First, our meeting in June will feature guest speaker Sunil Gupta, author of the book Backable: The Surprising Truth Behind What Makes People Take a Chance on You. Many of you may be familiar with Sunil's brother Sanjay Gupta, who is a neurosurgeon and chief medical correspondent for CNN. Sunil will be presenting and sharing some themes from his book with us in a Zoom format again on Friday, June 18th. The second announcement I have is based on Governor Whitmer's order yesterday. We are going to be able to resume in-person meetings at the Traverse City Country Club in July. The board has been weighing our options for returning to face-to-face meetings, and this order, allowing full indoor capacity, permits us to do that in July. More details will be coming soon regarding dates and speakers for July and the rest of 2021. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Benjamin Marentette has served as city clerk for the city of Traverse City since the confirmation of his appointment in September 2011. In his role as city clerk, Benjamin essentially functions as chief operating officer for a city government in one of Michigan's most thriving and engaged communities, with annual cash flow in excess of $150 million and assets that nearly equal that amount. He has oversight and leadership responsibilities in areas of finance, risk management, governance, licensing, elections, policy development, and more. Benjamin believes in providing white glove service and works to inspire excellence in the city's delivery of services. In 2017, Benjamin was accepted into and completed the Senior Executives in State and Local Government program at Harvard's Kennedy School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And in that same year, was named as Michigan's City Clerk of the Year, selected by his peers across the state. Benjamin serves as an advisor to numerous community organizations and has provided high-level advice on constitutional implementation to the Department of State. Benjamin proudly serves on the Rotary Charities Board of Trustees. He holds a MBA degree with a concentration in finance and leadership from Lawrence Technological University and a Bachelor of Arts in Organizational Development from Spring Arbor University. He loves a hilly run, is an avid sailor, an inspiring chef, and he and husband Matt Turner live in the city limits on the base of Old Mission Peninsula. Ben and I had a conversation earlier this week over Zoom, which we taped and will play now. If any of you have questions throughout the discussion, please submit them as usual through Zoom. Ben has graciously agreed to provide written responses to your questions over the next couple of weeks. Please start the video. Hey Ben, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, good.
Good.
Thanks a lot for taking some time to talk to the Economic Club today. I know you're a busy guy, so we appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to connect, at least virtually, and I look forward to doing that someday physically and in person. So I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, same here. So hopefully we're getting closer to that point to be back in person.
Yeah, for sure.
So the first thing I wanted to ask you, a lot of people, myself included, kind of think of your role as city clerk. We think about elections, but many people might not know what your other jobs are. So could you kind of explain to us what your jobs and responsibilities are?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. And I think you're in the same boat as, like you say, a lot of people. And so city clerk functions and role and scope changes a lot between states and even within communities. So Michigan city clerks, for instance, might do very different things than Nevada city clerks. The one thing that's sort of in common is most have election responsibilities, not all do. But then even in the state of Michigan, it varies greatly, the responsibilities from one city clerk to the other. And the best way that I can describe my role, especially to, I think the audience, we're speaking with today, is as chief operating officer for the city. And so I have responsibilities that span areas of finance, so financial oversight. There's about $145 million a year that flows through city coffers and city funds, and not one penny of that leaves the city without my sign off or the city clerk's sign off. So there's that financial oversight piece. I also oversee the city's official communications strategy, though we're actually right now really ramping up our capacity and bandwidth in that area by adding a full-time devoted person that's going to focus on communications and engagement. I have risk management responsibilities across the city enterprise. Licensing, all licensing goes through my office. So everything from special events, we have about 50 per year under normal circumstances, special events, liquor licenses, sidewalk cafes, food trucks, short-term rentals. There's about 30 different licenses that flow through my team. We also oversee all aspects of sort of the governance piece for the city in terms of any business item that goes in front of the city commission gets funneled through my team and distilled through my office. So we really have risk management, insurance, licensing, governance, communications, elections, of course, is a big piece. And finance as well. I can't remember if I listed that again in my bullets there, but that's sort of overall, it's a chief operating officer function here in Traverse City government.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a big job for sure.
I like
So
it.
are you voted in or are you appointed?
I'm appointed. Most city clerks in Michigan are appointed. There's a few exceptions, like for instance, Detroit city clerk is elected. Lansing's is elected, but I'm appointed, and it's a little unique how I'm appointed in Traverse City. I think it's I'm sort of a geek about city charters, which are city constitutions, essentially. And I think that Traverse City has one of the best government setups in terms of checks and balances and integrity of operations. And what I mean by that is in Traverse City, the city clerk is appointed by the city manager for an indefinite term, and it's confirmed by 5 of 7 city commissioners in the same process to remove the city clerk. And that's because my function has a number of roles where I need to be able to operate without undue influence or be able to have neutrality so that there's that checks and balances in place when it comes to signing all the contracts, the financial disbursements, for instance, and there's some other functions where I think it's just a better setup for in terms of integrity and professionalism that there's that way of appointment and removal of the city clerk.
Awesome. How long have you been the clerk?
9 years, flies by.
Okay, yeah, and what was kind of your background before that?
Sure. So I've largely served in city government my entire professional career. I like to be involved in other foundations, and I pursue a lot of education through other areas and try to just get as many perspectives as I can. I crave new knowledge and have a growth mindset. So while I've always been in city government, I try to keep myself really fresh. And so I've been city clerk for 9 years. I have an MBA with a concentration in finance and leadership, a Bachelor of Arts in Organizational Development, and a few years ago completed the Senior Executives in State and Local Government program at Harvard's Kennedy School in Cambridge. And so I've really worked to stay, like I said, fresh. Before I was a city clerk, I was a deputy city clerk. I've also served as executive director when the Traverse City and Garfield Township Recreational Authority was initially getting off the ground. And In the midst of that, I've served in some pro bono capacities doing communications consulting and coaching with medical school students at Michigan State University's College of Medicine, and just try to keep my hands in a number of different pots to keep that background relevant and keep myself ripe.
Cool. Thanks for your background. One of the main reasons we wanted to invite you to speak to the club was just to ask you some questions about kind of the economic position of the city.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we're kind of coming hopefully towards the tail end of a bad pandemic. How did COVID affect the city's finances, just kind of overall and per different area of revenue?
Certainly. So generally across the enterprise through all of our different funds and functions, it's not affected our revenue negatively. It's remained sort of on track for how we would have expected it to be, which is a steady growth before a pandemic was in the mix. But with it in the mix, it's really not affected city revenue, except for one key area I would mention is our parking system. So we have of course, a whole separate parking system that manages our parking structures, our parking facilities, and of course, use of parking decks. Our 2 parking decks is way down, which means the revenue for those structures and therefore that fund is significantly impacted negatively.
That makes sense. Has there been any talk about opening up Front Street again for the summer?
There's been, we've talked about it, but the decision's been made to not open it up to pedestrians like we had it last year. It's going to be what you saw in 2019 and before that, where it's going to be the traditional one-way. I think longer term, I think there will be more conversations about that, but there was a mixed reaction and impact for the different business types downtown. And so our Downtown Development Authority surveyed the stakeholders and really led the charge in advising that it's not something that we should do this year.
Okay. Just one final question kind of about COVID. How is that, I guess, has that had any impact on the pension funds? I know the financial markets have done pretty well throughout COVID, but has there been any impact negatively or positively on the pension fund?
In either direction, not really. Like you mentioned, Jeff, it's the stock market has done relatively well, and I think to some people's surprise, when you start to get into the psychology of the markets, it kind of makes some sense. But conventional wisdom might have said they were going to tank, and they didn't. And so same thing with our pension funds. Of course, there's a lot of restrictions on how you can invest pension funds. And so the investment opportunities are really modest. They're never high risk and therefore not really high yield either. And so it's remained relatively stable.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
So kind of want to move on to another topic that a lot of our members are interested in, but we're not maybe very well versed in, and that would be cannabis. And I know
Really? You're not well versed in cannabis?
I am not.
Okay.
So there may be some other members that are more than me, but we see kind of some different businesses popping up. We read about it in the newspapers. Can you kind of just tell us what is Traverse City's strategy when it comes to cannabis?
Sure. So it's sort of I have to give somewhat of what I'd call a two-pronged answer. So we have what's called medical marijuana used for medicinal purposes. You have to have basically a prescription from a caregiver to be able to acquire it. And then there's adult use marijuana. And so the city already has businesses in place that sell the medical marijuana. And we have 13 of, actually now 12 of such businesses in the city that sell it. And then there's other types of businesses related to medical marijuana, like the cultivation facilities or the sort of farming operations compliance facilities and so forth. So there's that going on right now. And that is all made possible through a law that was adopted by the state legislature. We have then adult use marijuana, which is a law that was passed by the voters, is an initiative that was proposed by citizens. And the adult use marijuana legislation, I say somewhat, cheekily, is a lawyer's dream because it's one paragraph of it disagrees with the next. So it's just ripe for all sorts of litigation. It wasn't professionally written. But it was enacted and approved by the voters. And so all these municipalities across Michigan are trying to figure out how to work with it. And in Traverse City, we have been ordered by a circuit court judge my office is not allowed to even begin accepting applications for adult use marijuana until we revisit the process of how we're going to competitively award the limited number of adult use marijuana retail facilities, because our city commission has taken the position they want to limit the number. And so that's sort of just a good lay of the land. With respect to sort of the approach, our city commission has taken a careful sort of zoning related approach, in the sense that they've not wanted to just say unlimited market forces can decide how many of these facilities we have in Traverse City. And the reason for that they've articulated is a concern that there'd be all sorts of space, retail space and so forth, gobbled up and maybe not necessarily sustainable. And then a concern about sort of this ghost town sort of effect. Like if we had 20 medical marijuana facilities open up on Front Street and only 2 of them could make it, how's that turnover going to look and how's that going to affect the market? That's been something that they've been concerned about.
Interesting. So in terms of kind of the fees or the revenue that could be generated from this, how much do you anticipate that would kind of bring into the city, and where would that be used? Would it just go into the general fund or designated for other projects?
Sure. So if we had adult use marijuana facilities in Traverse City, I had a recent projection that I think we would have received somewhere around $375,000 in revenue from the state that they would have allocated, because they allocate it based on the number of facilities that you have in relation to the number of facilities throughout the state, and basically just dividing it up accordingly. And so we've foregone that revenue right now, not because it's a policy decision of the city commission, but because we've been ordered to wait and revisit our competitive process for awarding. And so there's that piece. As far as medical marijuana revenue, we've received medical marijuana related revenue. We've received I think somewhere around the $35,000 a year mark since we put it into place. And that's been 2019. Now, I will say, when we initially accepted applications for a medical marijuana lottery, we had about $400,000 in application fees we received, but that was a one-time sort of windfall. To answer your second question about what would the funds be earmarked for? They would go into the general fund, and then it's really at the city commission's discretion as to how they want to allocate the funding. We are limited on how much we can charge in terms of application fees, to up to $5,000, but only to cover our costs. So we have to justify those costs. Though with that said, they're costs we would already really endure for the most part, because we're talking about compensation for employees that just aren't doing other things.
Okay. So out of your total annual revenue that the city brings in, it seems like it's still a relatively quite small part of that.
It is. Yeah, relatively speaking, it is quite small.
Okay. Okay. I don't have any other questions about that topic, but maybe we can move on to another one that brought a lot of interest amongst our board members,
Sure.
and that's the election.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously this past election was pretty unique with the pandemic and with I think a large increase of absentee voting that happened. could you just kind of tell us how the election went from your perspective, and how safe it was?
Sure. So I'll first say that in 2018, when there was a proposed constitutional amendment to Michigan's constitution called the Promote the Vote, or Prop 3 initiative, which provided for no reason absentee in Michigan, same day voter registration, and those types of measures, I was a strong supporter of it. And then I sat on the Secretary of State's small team of national and local folks to come up with a roadmap for its implementation. So I believe strongly in the security and integrity of absentee voting. I'd be happy to get into why I feel that way. But with respect to how the election went last year, so it was the first presidential election cycle where we had no reason absentee voting in Michigan. So even without a pandemic, I think we would have seen a huge surge, especially if we look at other states that have similar options in absentee voting, which really shifts at the polling place on election day to in the local clerk's office for the month and a half leading up to election day, because you're handling all these extra absentee ballots. But we had a pandemic in the midst of everything. And so that, of course, was a curveball in terms of really understanding how many people would have voted absentee under sort of normal circumstances. We had a tremendous amount of folks vote absentee. We had a roughly 300% an increase in absentee ballots over the presidential election in 2016. And so that was wonderful to see. What remains to be seen is if we, and I hope we get an overall increase in voter turnout, not just a change in how people vote. I'm all about providing convenience as long as there's security in place and that the process is truly preserved and protected. But my goal is to drive up voter participation, overall voter turnout.
Yeah, that's a good goal for sure.
Yeah.
So obviously it's become very politically charged with different voting laws that are being passed in different states around the country.
Right.
But just maybe brief comments on how do you feel about what Michigan's looking at doing and some of the changes they're talking about?
I think some of the changes are really good, they're a step in the right direction. For instance, allowing clerks to begin processing absentee ballots for a period of time before election day. Right now, you can only begin processing at 7 a.m., with the exception of jurisdictions of a much larger size. There was some special exception made. And so we need that extra time to process absentee ballots because there's only so much bandwidth, and there's a lot of steps along the way on election day to actually tabulate these ballots. There's a whole chain of custody and sort of assembly line, if you will, that ensures the security and the anonymity of the voters. So if, Jeff, you voted absentee, they can't tell how you voted when they opened up your absentee ballot. And so, things like offering up that additional time are good. There's some other provisions in place that I think make a lot of sense for driving up voter confidence. There's some other states that are proposing some measures that I'm just completely against. And I'm, for the record, very against things like laws that prohibit the ability for folks to bring water or nourishment to folks who are waiting in line, because in some jurisdictions you might wait in line for 3 hours. I see no public benefit or truly election related benefit of such a thing. It's really just to keep people from voting. They get thirsty or hungry and you're telling them nobody can bring you anything. That just doesn't make any sense unless you're just trying to drive down voter participation. And of course, I'm against that regardless of what the outcome is.
Good. Well, it sounds like our city, things are going really well when it comes to election security. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another issue I wanted to ask you about, I think you mentioned it briefly as being one of your responsibilities, is short-term rentals.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been a tremendous kind of growth in that area. And I know the city's put in some rules and some different zoning restrictions in areas, but Could you just kind of talk about, what the pros and cons are of short-term rentals and what the city's strategy is in regards to them?
Sure. So I will say just genuinely that the regulations for short-term rentals and the development of them is generally not something that goes through my office. That's largely a planning commission vetted item, and then it ultimately goes to the city commission. I certainly have the ability to help influence and shape a little bit, but I'm not the one sort of in that particular policy development seat. With that said, I have, and we may talk about this later, but I have a lot of concerns about the housing market in Traverse City, and we can get into that. And short-term rentals have a dynamic that's part of the housing market, and there's good and bad that comes with short-term rentals. I don't think anyone's found the secret recipe in terms of a regulation that is absolutely perfect, but there's a number of things that you have to balance. I think you want to try to make sure in a community that there's a diversity of housing stock and price ranges so that you can integrate multiple people across different economic segments into the community. And for some, that means, if you're a person making, for instance, $45,000 a year and you want to afford a house in Traverse City, it might mean that you need to be able to rent it out periodically for shorter terms to just help make that even possible for you. You might want to make improvements to your house, and the only way you can do that is through that revenue. You might want to just rent a room out, and that's a different type of rental, and that works for you. I get concerned when there's a proliferation of units that are put in, housing units that are put into a city, including ours, and they're solely for the purpose of short-term rental. And I think there needs to be some of that. I don't think it should be a free-for-all. You need to sort of develop what are your priorities? What's your guiding philosophy? What are you trying to encourage and avoid, and develop a policy around that? And that's a constant discussion here. And so have I at least generally answered your question?
I think so. I think that totally makes sense, that a balanced approach is really what we should be looking at. So
I will say that there's a bill pending in the Michigan legislature right now that would completely eliminate local control or local regulation on short-term rentals. So it basically make it a free-for-all. Some people, maybe me saying free-for-all seems a little loaded. Some people would consider that a really good thing. I think that it's, really important for local communities to work and decide what's best for them. And so I'm against that piece of legislation, but it's out there. Some people would be happy if it goes through. I don't think it would be good for communities across Michigan. That's my professional view.
okay. So we chatted briefly last week, and you threw out an interesting stat. Basically, we're talking about the economic value per acre of the city and kind of comparing that to the whole region. But for the rest of our members, could you give us a sense of how valuable the city is and how that compares to the whole economy of Northern Michigan?
Sure. So I'll first talk a little bit on the more micro level. And that is to say, we had a few years ago a economic productivity per acre sort of study done in Traverse City. And basically, I'll characterize it first by saying Walmart and the Grand Traverse Mall in this area, they're not in the city, they're in Garfield Township, Traverse City mailing address, but not city limits. Walmart, it basically generates about $385,000 in taxable revenue per acre. The Grand Traverse Mall is somewhere around $841,000 per acre. Overall in the city, the general range per acre is $5 to $15 million in tax revenue per acre. And of course, I'm talking about Garfield Township sort of compared to the city. You get into some jurisdictions and there's even more of a spread. But to give you a little bit more of an idea, 101 North Park, where Grand Traverse Pie's main location is, that generates over $51 million per acre. $834,000 per acre for Grand Traverse Mall, $51 million per acre for 101 North Park. It would take 2.5 acres of red ginger, for instance, and its taxable productivity to equal roughly 65 acres of the Grand Traverse Mall. So just some kind of measurable comparisons there. And so why it matters is you need an economic hub to help make a region really work and thrive. We can't have just all urban environment in a region. We need farmland. Some people want homes that have wide open spaces. Some people want to live in a community where they're right next to their neighbor and they can smell what's cooking in their kitchen. Other people would hate that. But at the end of the day, in terms of economic impact, there's a tremendous amount of economic productivity, and the ratio of that in Traverse City is really impressive. And it's extraordinary when compared, and I say this respectfully, these are just dollars and cents, when compared to other jurisdictions within the region. And they all have their value that they add. So, I mean, I'll say also, though, that Traverse City, half of the city of Traverse City's property within it is not taxable. It's hosting the airport, a great institution, very valuable, but still not generating tax revenue. Munson, also very valuable economic driver, important institution, schools, churches. So over half of the city's property is not generating tax revenue. But I think we're fortunate that we have so many businesses in Traverse City because it actually helps keep the tax rate low. You see communities like Huntington Woods, Michigan, that are 98% residential and just 2% commercial, and their property taxes are through the roof. I mean, truly, because they just don't have that diversity and the tax contribution and payments that businesses make to help make a whole community work.
That's really interesting. How do you feel as we're looking out kind of in the future, and if the city continues to grow, hopefully, how does our infrastructure look, or where do you see areas that might need improvement?
Yeah, and that's a great segue because that's partly why that taxable revenue per acre really matters, because it helps support the infrastructure. We have a lot of aging infrastructure in the city, a lot of aging water, wastewater infrastructure. We've got capital improvement plans that seek to take a measured and hopefully effective approach so that we're able to swallow the pill and also keep all this infrastructure working. And so it's the continued increase in tax revenue obviously helps support that infrastructure. Some of that infrastructure, like wastewater infrastructure, is funded really by the users through the fees that are charged. So it's sort of a self-sustaining like business unit run by a government, but a business unit. And then there's other infrastructure like our roads and other facilities that need continued sidewalks, that need continued tax revenue to help make a more walkable, livable, attractive city, and one that's just well maintained.
Sounds good. So another topic I wanted to bring up, because I've had some friends make some complaints about this. Sometimes more jokingly, but parking tickets and parking fees. How do you guys come up with a strategy, or how do you set your prices for parking? Mm-hmm. And in terms of enforcing it, how do you come up with a plan that I know you're trying to kind of maximize revenue, but you also don't necessarily want to make people upset?
Right. Yeah, I've gotten those yellow envelopes on my car with a ticket, and never fun. I'll talk a little bit about why we charge for parking, and then address your question on how we go about setting the rates, if you will. And so, yeah, I know a lot of people don't like paying for parking, who really loves it. Though if you go into a much larger city, or even a city the size of Grand Rapids or Lansing, it's a lot more expensive to park there than it is here in Traverse City. So I've got to, at least give that context. But with that said, the idea around charging for parking is to make the best and most productive use of land. So to provide for concentrated parking with a strategy so that it's placed where it should be and not have surface parking lots, for instance, all over the place. So we have two public parking decks that collectively have in round numbers, roughly around 850 parking spaces. So that's a lot of surface land that would otherwise have been used as parking lots and is now, lively economic generating businesses and other much more compelling public space. And so it obviously takes money to manage, build, maintain those parking structures. The parking spaces downtown that have those parking meters that most people don't love, those are in place to create turnover, for instance. So we don't want people staying and parking in one spot forever. And there's a balance that's taken in terms of what are the parking restrictions in terms of what's the max time you can spend in a given parking space, given the context of what's around it and what works to keep things humming along. And that obviously costs money in terms of enforcement, and it's also contributing to the infrastructure and maintenance, I should just say, for the parking decks. So how do we set the fund? How do we set the fees? So the Downtown Development Authority, which manages the parking facilities for the city, recently went through a transportation demand management study where they're looking at what's the most productive use of each parking space. And I'm just going to talk high level here. And what's the right amount of turnover? When should the price be higher because demand is higher and you want to change, or when you want to change behavior? And so it takes that sort of approach. And then it also obviously is based on what are the capital needs? What are the revenue needs to maintain this system that we have? And so the city is not allowed to just rack up money and make tons of money. It's just supposed to, in an enterprise fund like this, sort of a business unit, it's just supposed to make the amount of money necessary in order to sustain itself.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for explaining that.
Sure. Maybe you'll make your friends feel a little better, or you'll be poking the bee's nest if you bring that up. I don't know.
Well, we'll see.
Right.
So I was just poking around a little bit on your website, and it said one of your roles and responsibilities is to recruit to volunteer boards and committees for the city.
Yeah.
So I wanted to just give you a chance to maybe put in a plug to our membership about that and see if anybody might be interested.
Thank you. Yeah, so we are always looking for volunteers to help power city government. And so we've got a wide variety of boards and committees, from the Arts Commission, the Downtown Development Authority Board, the Planning Commission, which has a huge role in shaping how this community looks, how it's set up, the vibe, the feel, the economic activity based on zoning and the types of it. We've got the Traverse Area District Library Board, Traverse City Light and Power Board, which is essentially the board of directors for our electric utility, and Historic Districts Commission, everything from A to Z. And there's a description of all those boards at traversecitymi.gov. And so folks can check that out. But we're always looking for people to step forward and give us the benefit of their perspective. And it's a great way to get involved and really help make an impact. Now, I will say the boards vary in terms of the amount of time that's necessary. How many meetings do they have? How long are their meetings? What's the sort of prep? How much reading do you have to do? So there's something for everybody. So someone who really might be like, I just want to serve somewhere, but I only have a few hours, even a year to give. There's a board for that, on up to the Planning Commission that has typically two 3-hour meetings every month. And then there's a few hours in advance of each of those meetings of reading to do, plus all the interactions with constituents. So a lot of opportunities. Thank you for letting me give a plug. And anyone who's interested in serving, please reach out to me or a member of my team in the city clerk's office, and we'd love to chat with you about it.
Sounds good. So I had sent out last week, Ben, to our board members request for some questions, and we had some that came back. So I'm going to ask you a few of these. So
Great.
one that came in was, what is the weirdest thing you've learned from experience about city clerks and their role, and the
Hmm.
most surprising and heartening?
The weirdest, that's a fun question because that's like, yeah. So I mentioned at the onset when I was talking about how there's such a variety, like city clerks and their role can vary so much. And I've got a lot of variety in mine. I mean, you can be dealing with something from selling somebody a cemetery, a plot in a cemetery, all the way through reviewing a, $22 million transaction to everything in between. So it's just that you can go from such an extreme. Now, I will say something that might be surprising is I actually tended bar. It's a random story for a whole 20 minutes, just impromptu at a bar in the UP. And I found people told me so much just mixing them a drink. And I am surprised sometimes, and I'm happy to be a sounding board, but some people, I almost sometimes feel like I'm the bartender of the city in that respect, where people will just share a whole lot with you. And I guess maybe it's a compliment that they feel comfortable. They trust me and know I'm not going to reveal their personal business, but they'll tell you a whole lot and tell you how they feel about other people. And so you're somewhat of like the bartender or the hairstylist, where you just people download. So that's, I don't know if that's weird, but it's not necessarily maybe expected.
Oh, that's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
This kind of a similar question, but what's the most positive thing about Traverse City? And then also, what is a problem that needs to be addressed that might keep you up at night?
Sure. So what's the most positive about Traverse City? I'll kind of lump it into just a couple of things if I can do that. And it's, I would say this this town, this community has a tremendously engaged group of it's an incredibly engaged group. People care, they're passionate, they've got lots of ideas, and I like that there's not a fixed mindset here. So there's always like thinking around corners and how can we make things better. Let's not just be like, we're awesome, we can just keep doing what we're doing for the next 20 years. So many people trying to figure out how to level up. And I love that it makes it challenging. There's, in my role, there's a lot of people pushing, and I like that a lot. And so I think that's a real positive. Something that keeps me up at night is the cost of housing in Traverse City. That's something I really, really, there's a lot of people who care about this. But we really need to come up with a real strategy with specific steps and have the tools available. Because some of these tools that would be necessary require action at the state and maybe even federal level. But I worry about the cost of housing. I think that, especially even in the last year, but it's been an issue for a while, that we do not have an economically integrated city fully, and that gap is gonna widen even more. I'm not suggesting that someone who's just starting out ought to have a home on the bay or a 2,000 square foot penthouse condo, but there ought to be a place for everybody. And I worry about that. I think that there's a lot of professional people who are a two-income family that would make what most people consider to be a healthy sum, and they probably couldn't buy their house from themselves. So it's just, I worry a lot about that. So happy to talk more about it, but it is something that does worry me and sometimes does keep me up at night.
Yeah, it's definitely a big issue. We had some other questions come in on the housing, affordable housing topic.
Mhm.
So I think you sort of answered most of those right there. But are there one or two things you think that should be done, that you think should be done to help that?
Yes, I would like First off, it's a math problem. So in Traverse City, property is expensive. That is what it is. No one most likely is going to give it away unless we got a really generous philanthropist who came in and bought up some really expensive, I mean, even property in parts of the city that not that long ago were pretty affordable. Now, I don't consider affordable. And so absent that, which I don't really see that happening, I would like to see some tax incentives or essentially some subsidies. That's the only way it's going to happen. Subsidies and or areas of Traverse City that can build up so that the cost per unit goes down, because the cost of land is fixed. And the only way to drive that down is to put more on it. So it's a zoning issue. It's something that the community's got to be willing to accept too. There's a lot of people in this town who feel really strongly that they don't want to see buildings over a certain height, and I understand that. But those two issues don't really seem to coexist very well. So some of the priorities either have to change, or we've got to have some of these subsidies in order to provide for affordable housing.
Yeah. Do you think COVID has played a role in this because people from big cities have realized they can work from anywhere now and they're moving here?
Oh, absolutely. I think it was a challenge, no doubt, before COVID. It was a big challenge, but now it's even more so. I am hearing so much about it's such a seller's market right now. So a house that maybe would have sold a couple of years ago in the city for $250,000 might sell for $450,000 cash. And a lot of homes are only selling to cash buyers because people that are selling, and I understand this, want the surest deal. The mortgage is always something that might not go through. And people are taking just the best offer over a 24-hour period of time. And so, yeah, we've seen a lot of cash come in from areas like New York City, Boston, Chicago. And that's wonderful in some ways. Like, it's great for tax revenue, for sure. And there's benefits of that, but it is not great for a housing market that includes more people.
Yeah. So yeah, last month we had the Home Builders Association speak to the club, and they also talked about some of the challenges right now with high commodity prices and labor shortages.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely a major issue that we need to watch out for.
Yes.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So let me ask you one more cannabis question.
Okay.
How has public sentiment toward cannabis affected the role or responsibilities of the city clerk? What has driven Traverse City's strategy for cannabis retail opportunities? And how do public perception and economic development fit into this equation?
First off, all marijuana licenses are funneled through my office. They're issued by the city clerk, based, of course, on ordinances and policies that were adopted by the city commission and developed through a public process. But that I will say that it's added additional workload, of course, because we've got additional licenses to issue, and the constituents that we work with that are medical or marijuana licensees are just higher touch. There's a lot more interactions with them. There's sometimes obstacles with respect to understanding the regulatory environment that they're operated in. So there's multiple touch points. I think that there's a real opportunity for some consultants to get into business to really help these folks through. So there's sort of that piece, and it's just, that sort of is what it is. And then as far as the approach, I mentioned earlier that our city commission didn't want to have like a marijuana row or sort of this marijuana business ghost town effect where space might get gobbled up and then it's not really going to survive. So the city commission's taken that into account. Public sentiment, so voters in Michigan, over 61% of voters in Michigan supported the legalization of recreational marijuana, what we call adult use. More people than that, I think closer to 70% or north of that in Traverse City supported it. So our city commission heard loud and clear that the voters said, we want adult use or recreational marijuana. And so there's support for that. The city commission's said unanimously and gone on record that they want to provide for these businesses to be able to sell it. We're right now not authorized to because of litigation the city has faced from medical marijuana licensees that assert that by virtue of the fact that they have a medical marijuana license, they're automatically entitled to adult use, which the city contends is not accurate. And so that's gone through litigation, and the court has said we can't accept any applications or even move forward until we sort of work through how we're going to competitively award those licenses a little bit more.
Okay, appreciate that. One last question, I think, is all we have time for. So I'll ask you this one. In what ways does the city clerk intersect with the county clerk, secretary of state, city manager, downtown development authority? I won't read the rest of them, but I guess the main point is how do you interact with all these different agencies? And
Sure.
Also, if you want to add maybe something about what you learned at when you were at Harvard, if that how that helped you with this.
Yeah. So first, I love that the city clerk's office is a hub of city government. Everything that happens in city government comes through my team in one fashion or another. So that naturally means we're having a lot of interaction with the city manager or city manager's office, the downtown development authority. You know, the CEO of the DDA, Gene Dorenzi, and I are in constant communication talking about what's the value add for these regulations we have downtown, like sidewalk cafes, liquor related regulations. How can we balance the need to sort of govern, if you will, with helping businesses thrive? And how can we together provide an environment that really is thriving downtown, because that has a trickle effect economically. So and then all sorts of other things that are going on between the DDA and the city. We're in sync. The county clerk's office and my office work together some on elections, and so there's connection there. The Secretary of State and I know each other personally, and I've work directly with the Bureau of Elections on a number of things, which reports to the Secretary of State. I've advised and sat on task forces, helping them implement legal changes, constitutional changes, and give advice from sort of the city perspective. And so there's a lot of interaction between the Secretary of State's office and my office. And virtually just about every other public institution in one way or another, just because we need to. And I really believe in being open. I want to sit down and talk with people and figure out the best way forward and try to find our pathway to yes if we can. And you can only do that if you're bringing people into the room. So that's a core part of my philosophy. And you asked something I learned at Harvard, right?
Yeah, so that probably should have been its own question, but yeah, can you tell us your number one thing you learned when you spent some time there?
Number one thing I learned, there's a lot of stuff that I learned that I've become a geek about, like decision architecture, for instance, but this may sound overly basic, but it's honest. The number one thing I learned, I interacted with a ton of really smart people that were in the program, as well as professors and experts that are considered gurus from around the world. And I asked them questions like, how can we address this housing issue? And nobody's got the perfect answer. It's sort of like there's a basic recipe, and then you got to make it for your own community sort of flavor. That might seem like, you probably should have known that anyway before you went to this program. But it was affirming and gave some perspective in an environment where there's just a lot of really bright minds that you think you can get some perfect answers to. All that said, there's like 5, 6 subject areas that I could talk about for hours, like decision architecture, for instance, in negotiation and public policy development that I learned a lot about, but that overall was one of the general takeaways.
Very good. Well, I think we're almost at the end of our time, so I wanted to just say thank you again for coming to speak to the club.
Yes.
And we would love to probably have you back again. Hopefully, we'll be back in person soon. So
I'd be happy to join you. Yes. Thank you.
yeah, thanks a lot, Ben.
All right. Have a good one.
All right.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks again to Ben Marentette for coming to speak to us today. We're looking forward to seeing all of you again via Zoom on June 18th for Sunil Gupta. His book, Backable, is on sale at Horizon Books if you'd like to purchase a copy and read it prior to his presentation. We are also very excited to see you all in person in July and hopefully for the foreseeable future. Thank you for your attendance today and continued support of the Economic Club. This concludes the meeting and enjoy the weekend.